The teller didn't even look up. To her, it was just another scrap of paper pulled from the depths of a dusty, worn-out briefcase. In her 10 years at the First National Bank, she had seen thousands of them, crumpled deposit slips, grocery lists, old receipts, and occasional frantic notes written by stressed customers. When Elias Thorne slid the yellowed, folded parchment across the polished mahogany counter, she processed it with the same mechanical indifference she afforded a utility bill. Elias was an old man, his clothes smelling faintly of ozone and cedar, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from a suppressed, electric excitement that he had been nursing for 42 years. The bank was quiet, save for the rhythmic thwack-clack of a stamp hitting paper 3 stations down. "I'd like to see the vault manager," Elias said. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The teller glanced at the paper. It was covered in erratic, jagged lines, arcs that didn't quite close, geometric shapes that defied standard Euclidean rules, and annotations written in a tight, frantic hand that looked suspiciously like the messy scrawl of a precocious child. It looked less like a financial document and more like the frantic doodles of someone who had lost their grip on reality. "Sir," she said, finally making eye contact, her expression a mix of pity and annoyance, "if you're here to open an account or request a loan, I need to see a formal application. This is a child's scribble. I can't process this. It has no account numbers, no bank seal, and frankly, I can't even decipher the intent." Elias didn't blink. He reached out and placed a withered, liver-spotted hand over the paper. "It isn't a check, young lady. And it isn't a joke. It is a blueprint. And if your manager has an ounce of historical literacy, he will know exactly what this is the moment he sets eyes on it. Please tell him that the Thorne frequency has finally been stabilized." The mention of the name hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The teller's eyebrows arched. She had heard the stories, of course, everyone in this town had. The Thorne family had been architects of the city's early industrial boom, builders of the skyline that now loomed over the bank like a collection of stone sentinels. But the last Thorne had died in obscurity, leaving behind a legacy of madness and rumors of failed inventions that had supposedly burned his fortune to ash. She sighed, pressing a button on her desk. A buzz echoed in the back office. "Stay right there, sir. I'll call the manager, but don't expect him to be pleased about wasting his afternoon." While he waited, Elias looked around the lobby. He wasn't looking at the marble floors or the opulent chandeliers. He was looking at the air itself. He watched the way the fluorescent lights flickered, a subtle, almost imperceptible heartbeat that most people ignored. To Elias, the world wasn't a static collection of objects. It was a symphony of vibrations, and for his entire life, he had been trying to write the sheet music to control them. He remembered the day he had first drawn the lines on this very paper. He was 8 years old. His father, Arthur Thorne, had sat him down at the drafting table, the smell of graphite and ink permeating the room. "Elias," his father had whispered, his eyes bloodshot from nights of sleepless calculation, "the world is built on a foundation of hidden frequencies. If you can map the resonance of gold, or the vibration of steel, you don't need money. You can simply ask the universe to provide." That day, the house had been filled with the sound of a strange, high-pitched hum, a sound that made the windows rattle in their frames and the tea in the porcelain cups ripple in perfect, concentric circles. Then, the house had gone silent. And his father had vanished, leaving behind only the blueprints that everyone dismissed as the deranged ravings of a man who had spent too much time chasing ghosts. Now, decades later, the paper in the bank wasn't just a relic. It was a key. The vault manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, emerged from the back office. He was tall, thin, and possessed a jawline that suggested he had never allowed himself a moment of genuine joy in his life. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and marched toward the counter, his gait stiff and authoritative. "Elias Thorne," Henderson said, his voice clipped. "I haven't seen you in this branch for 20 years. I trust you aren't here to ask for another extension on that shack of yours on the edge of the woods." "I am here to facilitate a transfer of assets," Elias said, sliding the paper toward him. Henderson glanced down at the paper. His initial reaction was identical to the teller's, a smirk, a dismissive shake of the head. But then, as his eyes traced the central arc of the drawing, a complex curve that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle at which the light hit it. His breath hitched. He leaned in closer. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket, a nervous tic he used when examining rare coins. As he peered through the glass, his face went from dismissive to pale. That scribble wasn't a scribble at all. It was an intricate, multi-layered schematic, etched with a level of precision that made modern CAD software look like a finger painting. Henderson didn't speak for a long time. The silence in the lobby had shifted. It was no longer the heavy, uncomfortable silence of a bored teller, but a suffocating, charged atmosphere of realization. He saw not just the lines, but the mathematics hidden between them. The proportions were based on a base 12 system that had been abandoned by mathematicians centuries ago, yet here it was, rendered in ink that seemed to pulse with a faint, iridescent sheen. "Where?" Henderson finally whispered, his voice trembling, "did you get the conductive ink for this?" Elias allowed himself a small, sad smile. "That's irrelevant. What matters is what it does. You see, Mr. Henderson, people like you think wealth is a physical thing, gold bars in a vault, digits on a screen, paper promises backed by a government. But those are just shadows. My father realized that if you understand the frequency of the underlying commodity, you don't need to mine it. You can influence its availability. You can make it appear where it should be absent, and disappear where it should be abundant." Henderson looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and avarice. He was a man of the system, a creature of the ledger and the balance sheet. He spent his days obsessing over interest rates, liquidity ratios, and the cold, hard logic of the COMEX. He knew better than anyone that the entire global economy was a house of cards built on the assumption that there was always more metal waiting in the ground than there was paper claiming ownership of it. "This is a theoretical impossibility," Henderson muttered, though his hand, holding the paper, was now white-knuckled. "You're talking about quantum resonance as a tool for commodity manipulation. That's not banking. That's alchemy." "Bankers and alchemists have always been the same, Mr. Henderson," Elias countered, his tone hardening. "The only difference is that you hide your transmutation behind complex jargon and legal loopholes. My father's blueprint doesn't hide. It forces the world to conform to the truth." Elias knew the history of the bank better than Henderson did. He knew that this very building sat on the site of a failed assay office from the late 1800s, a place where miners used to bring their ore to be weighed and valued. He knew that the foundation of this building, the very concrete poured deep into the earth, was laced with the same trace elements he had used to create the ink on the parchment. It was a resonant circuit. The whole bank was an antenna, waiting for the right signal to activate it. "I need you to open the sub-level vault," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that silenced the entire lobby. "Not the public one. The one your predecessors sealed off in 1929 because they couldn't figure out why the gold weight kept fluctuating during the night." Henderson recoiled. "That area is restricted. It's structural. If I even open that door, the alarms will trigger a central security protocols. I could lose my position, my license, everything. And if you don't?" Elias gestured to the blueprint. "The blueprint is a key, Henderson. But it's also a trigger. If this document remains in the presence of a functioning bank's aura for more than 10 minutes without being properly indexed and neutralized in the subvault, the frequency will cascade. It will harmonize with the vault's own structure. You won't just have a security alarm, you'll have a total collapse of the local magnetic field. Every digital record in this branch, every encrypted ledger, every balance, it will be wiped clean. Do you want to explain to your superiors why the bank's total assets suddenly resolved to zero?" Henderson looked at the bank's primary computer terminal. It was humming, a low, rhythmic drone that he had never noticed before. But now, as he listened, he realized it matched the frequency Elias was emitting. The fluorescent lights flickered again, harder this time. A few customers in the lobby began to look around, their phones glitching, their screens flashing with static. "You're insane," Henderson breathed. But he was already walking toward the heavy, reinforced steel door that led to the restricted archive. Elias followed him, his boots clicking on the floor in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic pulsing of the building. He felt the history of the place pressing in on him. This was where his father had spent his last days, not in a sanitarium as the town whispers claimed, but deep within the bowels of the city's financial district, working as a janitor, a handyman, a ghost in the machine. He had been fine-tuning the architecture, turning the bank into the world's most sophisticated trap for capital. As they descended the spiral staircase, the air grew cooler and smelled of ozone and damp stone. The walls weren't just concrete, they were lined with copper coils, oxidized by time but still clearly functional. This was the heart of the beast. "We are entering a space of pure potential," Elias whispered. "Most people think the market is a chaotic storm. It isn't. It's a machine. And like any machine, if you find the right vibration, you can make it sing your tune." Henderson reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He held up his badge to the electronic lock, but his hand was shaking so violently that he dropped it. The badge clattered to the floor, sliding into the darkness. "Pick it up," Elias said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "The clock is ticking. The blueprint is already starting to resonate. Can't you hear it? The sound of your balance sheet dissolving?" Henderson knelt, his face contorted in a mask of desperation. He realized then that he wasn't just a manager anymore. He was a participant in an experiment he didn't understand, a pawn in a game that had been set in motion before he was even born. As Henderson scrambled to retrieve his badge, the air in the subvault began to thicken. It wasn't just cold, it felt pressurized, like diving deep underwater. The copper coils lining the walls began to vibrate, emitting a low, guttural thrum that resonated in the marrow of their bones. The blueprint in Henderson's hand had changed, the ink was no longer static. It was shifting, rearranging itself into a complex, rotating fractal that mirrored the geometry of the chamber they stood in. "What is this place?" Henderson gasped, finally clutching the badge and fumbling it into the reader. "This is the clearinghouse," Elias replied, his eyes reflecting the pale blue glow now emanating from the walls. "Or rather, it's where the clearinghouse should be. For decades, institutions have traded paper claims on commodities they don't hold, assuming the physical metal is just a ghost, an unnecessary weight in the ledger. They treat it as an accounting abstraction. But the universe doesn't deal in abstractions. The universe deals in mass, in energy, in frequency." The door groaned open, a massive, circular vault door that hadn't moved in nearly a century. Behind it lay not stacks of gold, but a vast, hollow space filled with intricate brass gears, pendulum-like weights, and thousands of miles of wire threaded through the masonry. It looked less like a bank vault and more like the inside of a gargantuan, ancient clock. "My father called this the harmonizer," Elias explained, stepping into the space with a sense of homecoming. He understood that the modern economy was decoupled from reality. By focusing on the paper value, the banks had lost touch with the physical anchor. He built this machine to reclaim that anchor. When the paper-to-physical ratio becomes too distorted, when the illusion of wealth stretches too far, the machine pulls back. It creates a vacuum. It forces the physical world to reset. Henderson stood frozen. He saw the logic now, the terrifying, elegant simplicity of it. It wasn't a crime, it was an audit conducted by the laws of physics. If a bank promised 10,000 ounces of silver but only held one, the harmonizer acted as a gravitational lens, bending the economic reality until the paper value collapsed into the physical truth. "You're not here to deposit anything," Henderson realized, his voice hollow. "You're here to activate the audit." "The audit is already active," Elias said. Above them, in the lobby, the chaos had begun. The fluctuating magnetic fields were wreaking havoc on the branch's internal systems. The flickering screens were no longer showing account balances, they were displaying raw, unfiltered data, the true inventory of every vault in the global network. It was a digital hemorrhage. Panic was spreading as customers saw their guaranteed holdings flickering toward zero, replaced by a blinking error message, resolution required. Henderson looked at the control console in the center of the room. It was a simple lever, made of polished brass, sitting in a slot that exactly matched the dimensions of the blueprint. He didn't need to ask what to do. The machine was screaming for the input. "If you do this," Henderson said, his voice pleading, "it won't just stop at this bank. The resonance, it'll travel through the grid. The financial sector is interconnected. It will cause a chain reaction. Every exchange, every central bank, every derivative desk linked to this frequency will experience the same collapse. You're talking about the end of the current monetary order. Elias looked at him with an expression of profound weariness. The current order is already a fantasy, Mr. Henderson. It's a collective hallucination where we've agreed that numbers on a screen are equivalent to the labor, the earth, and the sweat that goes into producing real assets. We aren't destroying the economy. We are simply waking it up from a fever dream. Elias took the blueprint from Henderson's trembling hands and placed it into the console. As the paper touched the metal, the entire chamber exploded with light. The sound, a pure, resonant chord that felt like the voice of the earth itself, drowned out everything. Outside, the world began to change. In the high-rises of the financial district, traders looked on in horror as their screens went black. The complex algorithms they used to hedge their bets. The high-frequency trading programs designed to scalp pennies from the market, all seized up. The machines couldn't calculate the value of an asset that was being forcefully re-anchored to the physical. It was a total, absolute, and unavoidable correction. Down in the sub-vault, the air grew still. The vibration vanished, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. The blueprint had been consumed, transformed into the final gear needed to lock the harmonizer into place. Henderson slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor. He watched as the brass gears slowly, methodically began to turn. They moved with the weight of centuries, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant finally awakening. What happens now? Henderson asked, his eyes unfocused. Elias stood by the console, his hand resting on the lever. Now, we wait. The world will try to patch the holes. They will print more, they will lie more, they will try to rebuild the illusion. But the machine is running now. Every time they try to stretch the paper thinner than the physical reality, the harmonizer will pulse. It will remind them of the truth. It will be the most transparent market the world has ever seen. The lights in the vault flickered once, then turned a steady, unwavering white. The bank above them was silent, the frantic energy of the day replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. That Scribble had done its work. The blueprint had become the foundation. And the world, whether it was ready or not, had just been forced to look at the math behind its own existence. The silence in the sub-vault was absolute, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 storms. Upstairs, the banking hall was not just quiet, it was paralyzed. The customers who had been screaming in confusion only minutes before were now standing in a daze, their devices dead in their hands. The digital infrastructure that underpinned their reality, the belief that their wealth existed as a tangible, immutable fact, had been severed. Henderson stared at his hands, which were shaking with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. You didn't just break the system, Thorne, he whispered, his voice cracking. You exposed the vacuum. People need the illusion. They thrive on the assumption that the paper has value. Without that belief, the entire structure of society collapses. The supply chains, the global trade, the very concept of exchange, it all rests on the blind faith that someone, somewhere, has the metal. Elias walked toward the center of the room, his movements deliberate. He didn't look like a revolutionary, he looked like a librarian who had finally filed the last book in a chaotic archive. Faith is a luxury of the blind, Henderson. I am simply providing sight. Look at this. He pointed to a secondary monitor that had flickered to life, displaying a cascade of raw, unfiltered inventory data from the global COMEX vaults. The numbers were staggering. The disparity between the registered silver, the metal physically available for delivery, and the open interest, the paper claims held by speculative investors, was not just a discrepancy. It was a chasm. It was a mathematical impossibility, a Ponzi scheme of astronomical proportions that had been hidden behind the curtain of market liquidity. It's not just the bank, Elias said, his voice cold and analytical. It's the entire architecture of global commodity trading. For years, they've been selling the same ounce of silver to 1,000 different people, betting that no one would ever actually demand delivery. They relied on the laziness of the market, the convenience of the ledger. They thought that Scribble, the math they ignored, would never matter. Above them, a distant, muffled roar began to grow. It wasn't the sound of an explosion, It was the sound of a city waking up to the realization that its currency was losing its anchoring. On the streets outside, the panic was beginning to manifest. It started with a slow, grinding halt to commerce. Electronic payment terminals stopped responding. ATMs went into a hardlock state, flashing messages of system maintenance that everyone instinctively knew were lies. The blueprint, now fully integrated into the harmonizer, acted as a global catalyst. It didn't just affect the local bank, it broadcast the signal of truth to every interconnected node in the financial network. The Thorne frequency wasn't a signal of destruction, it was a signal of recalibration. It forced every ledger to reconcile its paper claims against its physical reality. And in every instance, the result was the same, the ledger could not balance. Henderson scrambled to his feet, rushing to the monitor. He watched, horrified, as the global silver inventory plummeted toward zero. The paper market was imploding under the weight of its own deception. "We have to stop it," he pleaded, grabbing at the air as if he could physically reach into the screens and pull back the data. "If this continues, the price won't just rise, the mechanism of discovery will break. There will be no market. There will be no way to value anything. There will be a price," Elias corrected, his eyes fixed on the gears of the harmonizer. "It just won't be the price you manipulated. It will be the price determined by the actual, physical availability of the metal. If the world wants silver, they will have to mine it, process it, and transport it. They will have to trade in reality, not in derivatives." He turned to look at Henderson, and for the first time, Henderson saw a spark of genuine pain in the old man's eyes. "My father didn't hate the banks, Henderson. He loved the truth. He spent his life trying to prove that the universe is governed by laws that cannot be bribed, negotiated, or printed into existence. He built this machine to be the final arbiter, the judge that cannot be bought." The room seemed to shrink as the gears accelerated. The thump, thump, thump of the harmonizer was now a steady, driving rhythm, a heartbeat that was syncing with the city's own pulse. They could hear the sirens starting to wail outside, a discordant symphony of a society in the early stages of a total, structural breakdown. "They'll come for us," Henderson said, his voice barely audible over the thrumming of the walls. "When the authorities realize what's happening, when the central banks trace this anomaly to this specific location, they won't ask questions. They will destroy this place. They will destroy us." "Let them come," Elias replied, his voice calm. "The blueprint is already out. The signal is echoing through the grid. You can destroy the machine, Henderson, but you cannot destroy the truth it has revealed. Once the world sees the discrepancy, once they realize the paper was a lie, they can never unsee it. The illusion is broken." He stepped back from the console, leaving the lever in its new position. The machine was now autonomous, feeding off the very distortion it was correcting. It was a feedback loop that would only stop when the paper claims were fully reconciled against the physical assets, a process that would fundamentally rewrite the global economy. Henderson looked at the lever. He had the power to pull it back, to reset the system, to bury the truth for another generation. But as he reached for the brass handle, he hesitated. He remembered the look in the teller's eyes, the cold, clinical indifference of the system he served. He realized, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that he didn't want to go back. He didn't want to live in the lie anymore. He pulled his hand away. The end didn't arrive with a bang, but with a sudden, eerie, and absolute quiet. The sirens outside, which had reached a fever pitch of panic, suddenly ceased. The city, and perhaps the world, had reached a state of profound, stunned paralysis. In the deep subvault, the rhythmic thump of the harmonizer softened, transitioning into a steady, harmonious hum, the sound of a machine that had achieved its objective. Henderson leaned back against the cool, copper-lined wall, his breath hitching in his chest. "It's over," he whispered. "The data, it's stabilized. But it's all wrong. The numbers aren't what they were 10 minutes ago." Elias Thorne stepped toward the terminal, his posture relaxed, almost light. He peered at the screen, which no longer flashed error messages or frantic warnings. It displayed a single, simple, and unwavering value for the price of silver, calculated not by the frenetic trading of paper futures, but by the physical volume currently in circulation versus the actual, verified reserves. The paper price had been annihilated, and in its place stood a valuation that reflected reality. "It's not wrong, Henderson," Elias said, his voice soft. "It's honest. For the first time in a century, the market is telling the truth. The discrepancy, the gap between the promise and the reality, has been filled by the weight of the metal itself. Every paper claim that could not be honored by physical delivery has been nullified. The ledger is clean." Henderson looked at his hands, which were finally steady. The realization washed over him, slow and terrifying: the world he knew, the world of debt-based expansion, of endless credit, and of the comfortable lie that resources were infinite, was gone. In its place was a world that demanded accountability. "They'll kill us for this," Henderson repeated, but the fear was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow calm. "They'll try," Elias agreed. "But look at the screen, Henderson. Look at the network graph." The screen displayed a map of the world, connected by pulsing lines of light. The Thorne frequency hadn't just broken the bank, it had propagated. Every major financial hub, London, New York, Hong Kong, Shanghai, was now resonating with the same truth. The harmonizer was not just a machine, it was a catalyst for a global, synchronized re-anchoring. The signal had traveled through the fiber optic cables and the satellite links, forcing every exchange in the world to reconcile its books. The illusion of the child Scribble had been the only thing that could have brought down the empire of paper. "My father didn't just want to destroy the banks," Elias murmured, tracing the lines of the blueprint in his mind, remembering the way his father had explained the nature of value. "He wanted to restore the connection between human effort and the assets we create. He believed that when we trade in truth, we act with integrity. When we trade in illusions, we lose our souls." As if on cue, the heavy vault door groaned. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the mechanism, sensing the conclusion of its task, began to seal itself permanently. The harmonizer, its purpose fulfilled, began a slow, cooling down sequence. The brass gears, which had hummed with the weight of centuries, came to a final, definitive stop. "What happens when they find us?" Henderson asked, looking at the door. "When the board of directors, the regulators, the authorities realize that this wasn't an accident, but an act of creation? Then they will see the blueprint," Elias said, gesturing to the empty console where the paper had been. "And they will have to decide whether to try to rebuild the lie, or to live in the truth." Elias walked toward the staircase, his steps echoing in the vast, silent chamber. He didn't look back. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of his father's madness, and he had finally stepped into the light. He left behind the man who had been the manager of the lie, leaving him to decide his own fate in the new world that had been forged in the crucible of the subvault. Henderson stayed in the darkness for a long time. He could hear the faint, muffled sounds of people outside, the shouting, the confusion, and the slow, gradual realization that the world had changed forever. He stood up, walked to the console, and touched the place where the blueprint had been. The metal was still warm, vibrating with a residual energy that felt like the hum of a hive. He realized then that the scribble hadn't just been a blueprint for a machine. It had been a test. It had been a mirror held up to the face of a civilization that had forgotten the weight of the earth. He looked at the door. He could try to open it. He could try to go back to the world above and explain, to justify, to manage the crisis. But he knew, with the clarity of a man who had seen the gears of the universe turn, that there was no going back. The old world of shadows and paper promises was dead. He sat down on the cold floor, pulled a small, blank notebook from his pocket, and picked up a pencil. He didn't know the math that Elias had known, but he understood the principle. He began to draw. Not a blueprint for a machine, but a record of what he had seen, a testament to the day the bank called it a child scribble, only to discover it was the blueprint for the end of the world as they knew it, and the birth of a reality based on truth. Outside, the sun was rising, casting long, sharp shadows across the city. The financial district, once the center of a grand, intricate deception, was now just a collection of buildings. People were beginning to move again, tentatively, cautiously. They were looking at their hands, at the objects around them, at the world itself, with a new, questioning intensity. The era of paper was over. The era of the blueprint had begun. And somewhere, in the depths of a quiet, forgotten vault, a man was still drawing, mapping the frequency.